Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. When humanity confronts extraordinary evil, the reflex is almost always to look for the exceptional criminal, the sociopath, the radical fanatic, or the figure driven by deep, personal, monstrous malice. We create a psychological profile designed to be alien, something, entirely separate from the vast majority of normal people.
It's a deeply comforting idea, really, because it lets us believe that something like genocide requires a special kind of person, a monster. And if we can just identify and quarantine those pathological minds, we can prevent profound harm from happening again.
But our deep dive today centered on Hannah Arendt's monumental work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. It just completely challenges that entire framework. This isn't just a historical report, it's a structural interrogation of how modern, complex systems enable unimaginable destruction.
Right. Our mission here is to move beyond the sort of sensationalism of the history itself and focus on Arendt's enduring conceptual framework. We're going to be examining how ordinary systems, specifically bureaucratic structures, create the conditions for extraordinary harm, how they allow ordinary, unthinking people to become willing, efficient agents of mass atrocity just by following the rules,
So we're mapping the mechanics of obedience.
and the diffusion of moral responsibility. It's a deep dive into the architecture of administrative violence, and it all starts with a man who was, well, just shockingly normal.
Okay, let's unpack this book, its author, and the incredible shockwave it created. Hannah Arendt, she wasn't just a political theorist and philosopher. She approached this from a uniquely personal vantage point.
Absolutely. She was a stateless person for many years, a Jewish intellectual who had to flee Nazi Germany. She was, in a very real sense, a witness and a survivor of the very era she was observing. So when Adolf Eichmann was captured and brought to Jerusalem for trial in 1961, Arendt saw her attendance as more than just a professional assignment for The New Yorker.
It was a moral obligation.
It was a moral and historical obligation. She felt this might be her only chance to observe a figure like Eichmann up close, in a setting of justice.
But her goal was broader than just, reporting on the courtroom drama. She said her ambition was twofold. First, to understand Eichmann's mind, to see if there was some unique evil psychological engine driving him. And second, to explore, through all the testimony, the totality of the moral collapse the Nazis had caused.
And that collapse, in her view, it went far beyond the fanatics. It reached into respectable European society itself.
So when the report was first serialized in The New Yorker in 1963, and then published as a book, the reaction.
Oh, it was immediate. And it was intense. Vicious. The sheer controversy broke long-standing intellectual friendships.
The source notes are clear that the attacks were deeply personal. They often strayed far from the substance of her actual analysis. She was subjected to horrible accusations, being called a self-hating Jew, things that tried to undermine her identity rather than debate her ideas.
And the problem was that Arendt challenged several deeply held, very simplifying narratives that had emerged after the Holocaust. So critics, again and again, falsely claimed she had exonerated Eichmann or condemned the Jews.
Which was never true.
Never. She supported the death sentence. She never questioned the legitimacy of the Israeli court's right to try him. But her philosophical critique of the trial's structure, specifically its focus on painting Eichmann as this single unique monster, was highly unpopular, because to her, that focus obscured the real nature of systemic bureaucratic crime.
And her provocative writing style, I think we have to admit, certainly didn't help things.
No, it didn't. Her use of irony, what many people saw as sarcasm when dealing with such a profound tragedy, was seen as completely inappropriate. For instance, her description of the revered Chief Rabbi Leo Baik as the Jewish Führer, a comment she later took out that hit a raw nerve.
People found her tone cold, clinical, almost insulting when discussing such immense suffering.
Yet the most profound intellectual shockwave, the thing that really caused the uproar, was her analysis of the Judenreich, the Jewish councils that the Nazis established.
Right.
Her willingness to analyze the tragic and complex cooperation these councils offered, organizing their own people, compiling lists, that was seen as a betrayal. Now, other scholars like Raoul Hilberg had already documented these facts, but it was Arendt's sharp philosophical framing of the structural role of that cooperation that generated the outrage. It challenged the idea of a unified communal resistance.
And it's interesting, the source also notes Arendt's foresight in other areas, showing she was willing to hold unpopular positions based on principle. She grew disillusioned with official Zionist policy in Palestine, arguing that any lasting peace needed a modus vivendi with the Arab population, a sharing of power.
Her warnings against rising religious and nationalist fundamentalism seemed provocative then, but looking back, it shows a really keen eye for systemic, long-term geopolitical risks.
So when we clear away all the noise, the personal attacks, the arguments about her tone, we're left with the book's core, deeply unsettling structural argument.
Let's just state the thesis that forms the backbone of this whole deep dive.
Okay.
Hannah Arendt's core argument is that extraordinary, systematic evil can be committed not primarily by the radically wicked, or by fanatics, or by psychologically unique sociopaths, but by entirely ordinary individuals, functionaries, people who operate entirely within a system's rules, who defer all personal moral judgment to authority, and who have simply stopped the habit of critical thinking.
And that brings us to the most startling aspect of the trial. The man himself. This is where it gets really interesting. The idea that the man responsible for coordinating the deaths of millions wasn't a demonic mastermind, but just a mere unimpressive functionary.
The discrepancy was just profound. Arendt described him as mediocre, commonplace, unimaginative. This was not the cunning intellectual villain of mythology. Simone de Beauvoir used similar words for a French Nazi. A shabby, stupid, and vulgar lout. Eichmann presented himself as someone only interested in his career and his paperwork.
And the court psychiatrists, they just reinforced this image, didn't they?
They did. They examined him, looking for any sign of deep pathology, and they concluded he was a completely normal man. One of them famously said that Eichmann was more normal at any rate than I am after examining him.
Wow.
And for Arendt, that was the true enigma of the trial, the normality, the utter lack of profound thought or motive combined with the bottomless cruelty of his actions.
He was defined entirely by his role within the system.
Entirely. He only ever reached the rank of Obersturmbannführer, a middling lieutenant colonel. He wasn't a key political decision maker. And Arendt notes something crucial. After the war, hiding in Argentina, he missed his rank so much that he said he would have preferred being hanged as an SS officer in retirement than living quietly as a traveling salesman, his old job.
That one detail says so much. It tells you his identity was completely fused with his systemic status. The organizational structure gave his life meaning far more than any personal substance or even the value of his own life outside that structure. He was a perfect cog.
And being a perfect cog meant he had to renounce independent thought, which leads us to this key concept Arendt called Gedankenlosigkeit.
Thoughtlessness.
Thoughtlessness. But it's not the same as stupidity or even necessarily evil intent. It's an active refusal to engage with reality outside of one's professional role.
And his reliance on what Arendt called elating cliches was the main symptom of this. He had a stock phrase for everything, for every period of his life, which he used to shield himself from any kind of inconsistency or confrontation.
When he spoke, it was often just this stream of bureaucratic jargon or self-serving proverbs that had almost no connection to the horrific reality of his work. Arendt noted that even his boasting was all cliches. He told his interrogator he would jump into his grave laughing. He insisted he'd gladly hang myself in public as a warning example for all anti-Semites.
These weren't real expressions of remorse or even defiance. They were just empty.
Empty rhetorical flourishes, designed to give his actions some kind of historical weight and to insulate him from the guilt of specific individual crimes.
And this thoughtlessness was structurally supported by the Nazi regime's use of language. They created a whole system of euphemisms, final solution, resettlement, mercy, death, all designed so the functionaries never had to equate their paperwork with, normal murder.
Eichmann was the ideal subject for these language rules. He internalized them completely. The bureaucratic language became his psychological shield, manufactured by the state, that removed the human element entirely. If you're talking about transport capacities and absorptive rates of a resettlement area, you're not talking about human beings being sent to gas chambers.
You're just solving a logistics problem.
You're solving a logistics problem. And the genius of the bureaucratic structure, from the perspective of mass atrocity, is that distance. It allows the individual to focus solely on the efficiency of the paperwork, while insulating them from the horrifying physical consequences of their actions.
You see this so clearly when Arendt talks about the period Eichmann called his professional peak, his year in Vienna in 1938, where he set up the Center for Immigration of Austrian Jews.
At that time, he was absolutely desperate for career advancement, and he turned forced emigration into this spectacular success story because he approached it as a pure organizational problem that needed an efficient industrial solution.
He designed what he probably called an assembly line.
An assembly line. Instead of making Jewish applicants run between dozens of different offices, the tax ministry, the police, the Gestapo. He put all the relevant offices under one roof. The process became swift, humiliating, but seamless.
And the numbers are just chilling. This Vienna model, it maximized efficient atrocity. It resulted in 45,000 Jews leaving Austria in 8 months. For comparison, in the same period, only 19,000 left Germany, where the process was still decentralized and slower.
His pride wasn't in the policy itself. It was in the efficiency and the speed of his system. And that model was later exported all across occupied Europe.
Then, when the focus shifts from expulsion to extermination, the final solution, Eichmann's job, it doesn't really change, does it? He isn't the executioner. He's still a logistics manager, the chief coordinator of transport.
His administrative tasks were comprehensive, but they were mundane. He coordinated transport schedules, making sure he got the railroad cars he needed from the state railway. He managed timelines, calculating how many shipments a camp like Auschwitz could absorb per week.
And he spent a lot of time on internal bureaucratic politics, managing turf wars between the SS, the Foreign Office, the military, the regional governors, the Gauleiters, who were all competing over who could declare their territory Judenrein first. It was a job about flowcharts and memos.
This coordination was vital because the logistics of genocide operated on 2 distinct tracks. First, you had the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, who used mass shootings in the East. This was visceral, brutal violence.
And then there was the second track, the industrial mechanized gas factories. This grew out of Hitler's earlier T4 euthanasia program, which had used carbon monoxide to kill the mentally ill and disabled. That was then expanded to the mass extermination sites.
And Eichmann was exposed to both. He saw the carbon monoxide chambers at Treblinka. He was sent to Kulm, where they used mobile gas vans, and he saw the doors open and the dead bodies tumble out. He witnessed mass shootings at Minsk, where he remembered a spring of blood gushing from the earth.
This is where the systems analysis really comes into focus. Arendt documented that Eichmann reacted with profound physical revulsion to these acts.
He did. He confessed he became physically weak, suffered inner trembling. He refused to look into the gas van's peephole. He even told his superior, Müller, that he was not tough enough for sites like that.
And this is the key mechanism that allowed the banality of evil to function. Despite his physical revulsion, his administrative work continued completely uninterrupted.
Exactly. The system compartmentalized the atrocity. He didn't have to pull the trigger or open the valve. He just had to secure the railroad cars and file the transport manifest. The system protected him from the moral burden of the physical act, letting him focus on the abstract duty of scheduling.
That compartmentalization is chilling. But the source notes an even more complex moral failure. The one time his conscience, or what passed for it, briefly surfaced, it was entirely selective.
Right. Eichmann once defied an order to send a transport of German Jews to Minsk, which meant immediate death. Instead, he diverted them to the Lodz ghetto.
But this small act of defiance, it wasn't rooted in some universal moral conviction about the sanctity of life.
Not at all. He had no issue coordinating the death of Polish, Russian, or Eastern European Jews. But when German Jews, who were from our own cultural milieu, who might have carried iron crosses from World War I, arrived for special treatment, he and other ranking officers, they felt outraged.
So their morality wasn't defined by human rights. It was defined by a selective, internal, racist hierarchy, operating entirely within the parameters of the Nazi system. He cared about the status of the victims, not the act of murder itself.
Precisely. It was a morality of peer group recognition, not universal principle. And the system allowed for these selective moral compromises as long as the overall structure of destruction remained intact and efficient.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, Arendt isn't just giving us a biography of a man, she's mapping a machine of state violence. She's showing how these complex systems actually operate.
We really need to look at the interacting parts of the system he operated within to understand how this all became possible.
It was clearly a massive organization, way beyond just a small group of fanatics. Let's break down the key actors Arendt mapped out, because they all played these very defined roles in making the massacre work.
Okay, so you start with the bureaucrats, like Eichmann, the cogs. Their only concern was maximizing operational efficiency scheduling, transport filing. Their job was administrative, not ideological, though they often wrap themselves in ideological cliches.
Then you had the political authorities, the decision-makers like Himmler and Heydrich, and the regional Gauleiters. They're the ones dictating the directives. And Arendt notes they often engaged in fierce political conflict, competing with each other, which often accelerated the killings just to prove their authority over a Judenrein area.
And crucially, you had the legal institutions, the lawyers. This is where the whole veneer of legitimacy was constructed. They drafted this huge shower of regulations and directives to make sure the Führer's murderous order looked like law. By framing the Führer's word as law, they transformed a temporary criminal order into a mandate that required continuous commitment from the whole society.
It made compliance a duty, not just obedience.
Exactly. And finally, the most painful part of Arndt's map, the Jewish councils, the Judenrat. These were officials, often distinguished leaders, who were forced into this impossible position of organizing their own communities.
And Arndt's critique here, the part that caused so much offense, it was strictly structural, wasn't it?
It was. She argued that these officials compiled the lists, they secured the funds, they supplied the internal police forces, they distributed the yellow stars. By doing all that, they inadvertently streamlined the process for the Nazis. They helped eliminate the maximum number of Jews with the minimum of administrative effort and cost for the perpetrators.
That analysis forces you to confront the difference between individual moral intent, which was often desperation, a vain hope of saving some people, and the resulting systemic function, which was collaboration that just accelerated the death toll.
Exactly. The focus is on the mechanism.
Yeah.
But what kept this engine running? What were the core incentives that were embedded in the system?
The primary mechanism, according to Arendt, was this idea of procedural compliance and duty. Eichmann's repeated mantra was that a law was a law, there could be no exceptions. He insisted he was just fulfilling his duty, sometimes even acting against his own personal sentimental inclinations. He truly believed that this uncompromising attitude towards procedure was his moral justification.
And there was also simple career advancement. Eichmann was frantic to make good. He was desperate for promotion and recognition, which he earned with the spectacular efficiency of his Vienna operation. The system rewarded efficient implementation regardless of the ethical substance of the task.
And we should look at the role of material gain and efficiency. Arendt noted cases where corruption actually interfered with the purity of the murder system. For example, Croats paid the Nazis 30 marks for each Jew deported. But more significantly, the Romanians discovered they could sell Jews abroad for $1,300 a head.
Right. And this potential for profit meant the Romanians suddenly became fervent adherents of emigration instead of extermination. They realized there was more financial gain in releasing them than in killing them. It proves that while ideology and duty were powerful, sometimes just simple corruption could disrupt the cold efficiency of murder.
But the truly insidious power of the system lay in the complete normalization of its core narratives. Duty, legality, and normalcy. The Nazis fundamentally inverted morality and law.
Arendt explored this inversion through the distortion of Kant's moral philosophy. Kant's categorical imperative, it asks you to act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. It demands self-critique based on universal reason.
But how did Eichmann, a self-proclaimed reader of Kant, make that logical leap from universal moral law to Hitler's temporary criminal will? I mean, that is a profound act of moral contortion.
He rephrased it completely. He claimed the new imperative was, act as if the principle of your actions were the same as that of the legislator or of the law of the land, the Führer's will. By shifting the source of moral principle from internal universal reason to the external temporal will of the leader, the law effectively demanded, thou shalt kill.
And this inversion had a devastating effect. Arendt notes it removed the quality of temptation from evil. Moral people suddenly found themselves having to resist the temptation not to murder, not to rob, not to become complicit. The entire moral axis was flipped. Compliance became the virtue, and moral resistance became the criminal act.
You see, the absolute peak of this horrific efficiency in the feedback loops of depersonalization, especially where local authorities were fully cooperative with the Nazi system.
The Hungarian case in 1944 is the ultimate proof of this bureaucratic acceleration. In less than 2 months, over 434,000 people were deported on 147 trains.
The operation went, in Eichmann's own words, like a dream. And it went like a dream because the Hungarian gendarmerie and a well-versed state secretary collaborated fully. When the whole state apparatus is unified, compartmentalized, and operating under this narrative of legality, mass killing becomes incredibly efficient. It just demonstrates how bureaucratic zeal maximizes atrocity.
So we've mapped the machine that Arendt described. But what does this structural analysis mean for us today, living in a world that's dominated by ever larger, more complex, often opaque systems? The patterns aren't identified. They're not just confined to the 1940s.
Not at all. They persist, particularly the defense of just following orders. We still see this defense invoked today, whether it's in military conflicts or corporate scandals. General Jodl argued at Nuremberg that a soldier isn't supposed to judge his commander.
But Arendt showed that Eichmann dimly understood he wasn't just obeying a temporary order. He was complying with the law, the Führer's word, which demanded continuous obedience and turned everyone who participated into criminals against humanity. That's fundamentally different from a specific, isolated military order.
Modern law has the concept of the manifestly unlawful order, meaning an order so egregious it has to be refused. But that concept assumes that the criminal act is a striking exception from the legal rule. Arendt shows us what happens when the entire structure of society, the state, the law, the economy, is criminal. The law itself becomes the crime, demanding continuous compliance as a supposed duty.
This brings us directly to administrative violence and institutional harm in modern terms. Let's go back to the moral calamity of the Judenrat. It's maybe the most difficult part of the book to address because it forces us to look at systemic outcomes rather than individual choices.
They believed they were acting like captains trying to save their ship by throwing cargo overboard, hoping to spare some prominent lives by sacrificing others. But Arendt argued that whatever their intent, their function organizing the lists, running the internal police, resulted in them becoming instruments that aided the executioners. It maximized fatalities with minimal administrative cost to the Nazis.
That is institutional harm. The system took advantage of the victim's own organizational structures to facilitate their elimination. And this leads to another crucial point Arendt made. The Nazis introduced the category of prominent Jews in 1942.
And the act of the Judenrat selecting these prominent Jews to be saved implicitly validated the overall rule that the vast majority of ordinary Jews had no right to live. The system was structured to ensure that any attempt to save yourself or your group through institutional means just validated the underlying criminal structure.
And that institutional harm is magnified today through the diffusion of responsibility that happens in any large, complex organization. Accountability is deliberately atomized, delegated across departments and hierarchies.
Eichmann claimed his role was an accident, that anyone could have stepped into his shoes. And while that's self-serving, it holds a structural truth. The complexity of coordinating the final solution across so many competing state agencies meant responsibility truly was dispersed across thousands of actors, from railway schedulers to tax officials.
When we look at corporate malfeasance today, or massive governmental abuses from policy failure, think of the financial crisis, huge environmental disasters, systemic abuses in healthcare or border control, we see this exact same pattern. We see the horrific effects, but no single actor feels the full moral weight of the crime.
Each modern functionary can sincerely claim they were only handling their limited, efficient piece of the puzzle. This raises a crucial question for all of us. When accountability is so fractured, and when compliance is so easily rationalized by internal narratives of duty and procedure, how do we prevent the objective appearance of legality from overriding fundamental human judgment?
It's a terrifying thought, that the structural patterns are more significant than the individual actor. The system is the monster, and we are just the cogs.
We've seen how Arndt's deep dive into this one man unlocks these vast truths about power, law, and morality. Let's place this discussion within our broader theme at Crisis in Perception: the constant struggle between our perception of events and the systemic reality behind them.
I think we have to keep reiterating Arndt's core insight. This crime was not committed by some supernatural force or a single brilliant mastermind. It was an administrative massacre organized by the state apparatus. And the trial, Arendt argued, failed precisely when it tried to paint Eichmann as the sole, omnipotent monster.
Because that sensationalism obscured the structural reality. It obscured the fact that crimes of this magnitude are only possible within sophisticated, normalized systems of governance and bureaucracy.
The trial judges themselves, they struggled to even define the nature of the crime because it was a crime committed under legal authority. It forced them to judge freely, outside the bounds of existing law. It forced them to ask, what is a crime when the law itself demands it?
And defining the criminal was just as difficult. They knew that if Eichmann was a truly unique, perverted sadist, the trial would lose its broader historical significance. But so many were like him, terrifyingly normal. The only real evidence of a guilty conscience among the Nazi hierarchy, Arendt observed, was their feverish attempt in the final months of the war to destroy all the evidence.
which proved they knew that the law of mass murder wasn't yet accepted by other nations.
Exactly. And this leads to the most chilling finding, the dangers of unexamined normality. The realization that conscience as such had apparently got lost in Germany. This normalization of moral collapse was total. It even extended to the victims.
You're talking about that astonishing story Arendt tells about the Königsberg woman in 1945.
I am. Days before the Russians occupied the city, she calmly told a physician that she wasn't worried because the Führer, in his great goodness, had prepared for the whole German people a mild death through gassing in case the war should have an unhappy end.
And the physician noted that no one around them found this statement unusual or shocking. It was just accepted, normalized, integrated into their understanding of state policy. That shows the profound failure of judgment when obedience to the system becomes the highest moral virtue, when death by gassing is seen as a benevolent, protective act of the state.
So Arendt's ultimate challenge, it's philosophical. Thinking is a moral act. If you rely only on external rules or authority, and you retreat into the defense, who am I to judge? Well, you have already sacrificed your moral autonomy. Moral action depends on individual critical judgment.
The source material highlights this truth with a counterexample of Sergeant Anton Schmidt. He was a German soldier, a Feldwebel, who used his position in Poland to help the Jewish underground, supplying them with forged papers and military trucks. He was eventually executed for it.
And Schmidt's story demonstrated that the holes of oblivion do not exist. Totalitarian systems try to make resistance disappear into silent anonymity, but Arendt argued that his political failure, his execution, did not equal a moral failure. He, and the few like the Skulls, they went only by their own individual judgment because, as Arendt says, no rules existed for the unprecedented.
To resist systemic criminality, you needed the arrogance to trust only your own judgment, even when the entire respectable world around you was affirming that the criminal act was simply the law of the land. It's an act of deep isolation, but also profound moral courage.
So let's synthesize what Arendt's profound investigation really reveals about evil and responsibility. Her analysis shows that evil is rarely about radical, unique wickedness. It's far more about thoughtlessness, a fundamental, active failure to engage with the reality of one's actions, masked entirely by bureaucratic function.
And this thoughtlessness is aggressively supported by systemic language and the cloak of duty and organizational efficiency. Moral collapse appears ordinary, even respectable, precisely because the system clothes mass murder in the dry, complex language of legal and administrative procedure. It makes it look like just a large-scale job with daily routines and quotas.
The chilling effect of this normalization is that it requires a tremendous, almost painful effort to resist the pull of complicity. Arendt forces us to acknowledge that the great defense against administrative massacres isn't necessarily dramatic heroism, but the constant, vigilant, internal act of critical thinking, of questioning the premises of the system you operate within.
What stands out to me after all this is the immense difficulty of making an independent moral decision when the entire world around you confirms that the criminal act is just the law of the land. The refusal to take a position, to refuse to judge, is itself a fundamental moral abdication.
Arendt's analysis challenges us to recognize that if we accept the premise that when almost all are guilty, nobody is, we effectively grant impunity to the system itself. We absolve the organizational architecture of its crimes.
So the final provocative thought raised by this entire deep dive is this. How well prepared are we as citizens operating within our own complex, modern systems, corporate, governmental, or social, to resist the insidious comfort of procedural compliance and the normalization of injustice, especially when doing so means standing alone against the overwhelming weight of institutional normality? We've been diving deep into Hannah Arendt's essential work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author's work, or check it out from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.